Come rain or shine, Max Verstappen delivered a precise and commanding victory at the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve to take the top step of the podium for the 2024 F1 Canadian Grand Prix. Lando Norris brought it home for McLaren in second place, and George Russell finished third after a close battle with his fourth place teammate Lewis Hamilton in the final laps. Max did have to work for it, navigating changing weather conditions, concerns over his suspension, and both Norris and Russell leading the race at various stages, but he remained cool, calm and collected. The win. Here's how they finished. Verstappen in first, and he leads the Drivers' Championship by 56 points over Leclerc. Norris in second place, Russell third, Hamilton fourth, then Piastri in fifth. Alonso and Stroll in 6th and 7th, Daniel Ricciardo in 8th, and Gasly and Ocon in 9th and 10th for Alpine. Hülkenberg and Magnussen finished in 11th and 12th, those two taking the gamble to start on wets, but ultimately it didn't pay off as much as they'd hoped. Then it was Bottas in 13th, Tsunoda in 14th, and Zhou Guanyu, the final finisher, in 15th. And those who didn't finish, well, they were Sargent, Leclerc, Perez, Sainz and Albon, a disaster for Ferrari after the success in Monaco just a couple of weeks ago. Well, to talk through the race, I'm delighted to have trackside Jake Boxall-Legge and also our US Autosport editor, Charles Bradley. It's great to have you here. First of all, JBL, you got the race you were after, didn't you? A wet one, sort of.
Yeah, I was looking forward to a little bit of rain. Always the great leveler, as the cliche goes. And it threw a lot of spanners in the works, starting off wet. A lot of teams had to kind of adapt and cope. A little bit more rain came, just the circuit was drying out. So a lot to be aware of, a lot of strategy work that the teams had to do to try and get on top of it. So yeah, it was an exciting one, and it always is around here.
Yeah, it's always a nice one. I mean, Charles, you wrote in one of your columns that it was a wet and wild event, and it kind of was, wasn't it? But it was a very different performance from Max Verstappen. It was a calm and precise performance from him where, truth be told, elsewhere it was a bit messy, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Max was, again, just masterful, wasn't he? He does everything just so perfectly well and always comes up smelling of roses. On the flip side, on the other side of the garage, Sergio Perez was pretty pathetic, wasn't he, really? Mercedes had a day where they had a car that looked like it could contend for the victory, and then it got a little bit messy, and they fell a little bit short. McLaren looked really good at times too, and and then you've got Ferrari at the other end of the scale. They were just playing old flipping foul, weren't they?
Flipping foul, yeah, exactly. They had an absolute shocker, didn't they? We'll come to them in a little bit, but first of all, JBL, let's just talk about Max Verstappen, because there was this couple of moments through the race with some radio messages back and forth to his team. One, he mentioned that he thought he was having his suspension had locked or something. Can you tell us what he meant by that and what was going on? Yeah,
so I think it was more of a sort of turn of phrase more than anything, but we know how this Red Bull's set up, and the suspension is very stiffly sprung because, as we know, that's the way that the floor likes to work. So it got to a point where perhaps in the start he was kind of attacking the curbs a little bit more as it dried out, but the thing is, because the suspension's so stiff, it kind of acts like it sort of almost couples with the unsprung mass of the car. So from that point on, he just had to completely avoid curbs, which, you know, that kind of not saved his race as such, but saved him from a few headaches and anything like that. So I think that was basically where he was coming from there. So it's just a Red Bull limitation that they know that they've got. They're trying to improve it. And they're pretty confident they can do without compromising on the rest of the car. So, that's basically the situation from Max's standpoint.
He said after the race, didn't he, that it was a problem that they knew about, that they were going to deal with. It's also quite ironic as well. He said that he couldn't drive on a curb because it might knock him out, and then he went and drove on curbs. So it's that usual thing, isn't it? It's you kind of hear what they say and then you see what they do, and it's very different, Charles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's just he's got the handle on that car completely. I think he's driving to such a finite level that he feels these tiny things, and he explains them as if they're a huge deal, that you'd think that the car's about to, either break down or a wheel's going to fall off or something like that. And apart from, Australia, where he had the brake fire, it's just those little tiny things that he just needs to find to be perfect, really. And he just keeps delivering so many times, even when the car was difficult to drive, as it clearly was throughout the weekend. It wasn't their cleanest weekend, but they got the job done.
Yeah, they certainly did. And that's 3 wins on the bounce for him in Canada, which is very, very impressive. Now, what about his teammate then? Starting all the way back down that grid, it was always going to be tough for Sergio Perez, but a weekend for him to forget, wouldn't you say, Charles? I think that's pretty fair.
Well, I don't know. They've just re-signed him as the best option to be Max's teammate for the next 2 years. So his bank account's probably looking all right. But yeah, 2 crashes on the trot. He's 5th in points in the best car. He's been on the front row twice all year. He's got no poles. He's got 2 Q1 exits on the bounce. And Helmut Marko is obviously very important in the Red Bull setup, says he has psychological issues. Well, he needs to get that sorted out really quickly and get back on track. If this keeps going on, certainly Barcelona is a real litmus test, isn't it? That track's so indicative of what's to come in the rest of the year. If he doesn't get his act together shortly, then that 2-year contract might not be worth the paper it's written on.
When you're not feeling very well and someone says, oh, come on, you'll be all right. And you think, yeah, but currently I'm not feeling all right. Or you bang your head and someone says, oh, mind your head. And it's a bit too late. How helpful is it when somebody like Helmut Marko is saying, oh, it's psychological problems, it's not the car? How's that helping Sergio Perez? Charles, take that on.
Yeah, I guess it very much depends on the individual, isn't it? Some people like an arm around them. I think to Max Verstappen, you could say that. I think you can be very straightforward to him because I think he's very straightforward to other people. And I think Sergio is probably the opposite of that. I don't think he's a shrinking violet or anything like that. I think he is quite a tough nut, but he just has to get over this problem with he's having with the car at the moment, because Max is performing week in, week out, and Sergio's just underperforming, and he just needs to. And if it takes a kick up the backside, I don't know what it does really, but he's either going to be a cuddle or a kick up the backside to get him back on track.
Yeah, it's a weird dynamic, a kick and a cuddle at the same time, maybe.
Yeah.
Now, JBL, McLaren, I think they might be maybe a bit disappointed, 2nd and 5th for them with Norris and Piastri respectively. They seem to have the pace though to do better than they did.
Yeah, and Lando Norris said that he should have won the race. Pure and simple, and it wasn't a matter of, let's say, missing the boat with the safety car. It wasn't like a Miami situation where he took the lead because Verstappen was stuck behind the safety car. He wasn't stuck behind the safety car. He said that there was an opportunity for them to pit, and ultimately McLaren didn't react to that time window that he had. So they had to go round another lap, by which point he'd caught the safety car. And so that kind of pit stop delta was no longer there. And he was in a situation where basically it was bordering on 10 seconds, that lead, and that had evaporated because of that safety car time loss, and even the sort of like reduced time loss of a pit stop under the safety car didn't help him, and ultimately he dropped down to 3rd. So that was basically the nail in his coffin. It wasn't like his later stop when he tried to build a 2-lap offset with the intermediate tyre. Actually, he said that was very, very helpful because he was in a position where he didn't feel like he could attack, and then suddenly he could sort of have a little bit more of a go of it in that situation. So I think McLaren kind of giveth with one hand a little bit later on, but they'd already taken with the other, unfortunately. He did genuinely believe that he should have won that race.
He was very good in the post-race interview that I saw on TV, though, Charles, because he didn't moan about the safety car. He didn't say, oh, I can't really complain because it played into my hands when I won, and so I can't really complain about it. But you can see there's a different temperament about Lando Norris now. He seems to be, he's won a race, that monkey's off his back. He seems to be a very, very different driver and a more composed driver and character off track too.
Yeah, I said this in our show after he won in Miami that I thought this was the sort of trigger point that could really allow him to kick on and win regularly or appear, even more regularly on the podium. And I think that's exactly what he's doing right now. I thought it was quite funny to hear from the engineers as it swayed backwards and forwards, didn't it? The first safety car benefited Max, and then the second one kind of brought it back in. And I did, as JBL was just alluding to, I loved his attempted overcut there that really nearly came off if the track had just stayed a little bit wetter because the crossover point just came a little bit too soon for him. But I also agree that not pitting that first time was the error, and it was difficult to bounce back from there. But it's like they do in NASCAR. If you've got some new boots, chuck them on. Smoke them if you got them. don't leave the tyres in the warmers in the pits. Just get them on and go for it.
Yeah, Charles is right about Lando's attitude. He did say in the press conference after the race that McLaren is now a winning team for the first time in 3 years, and so it has to cut its cloth, I guess, accordingly. It now has to sort of expect to win these kinds of races. So he was a bit disappointed that he hadn't. I think, obviously teams sort of learned from that, and they'll come back from it and be stronger the next time. And Formula One teams, I guess it's almost an allegory for life, really. You do learn a lot from the failures you make. But obviously you kind of also wish that you hadn't made them. So I think they'll sort of go back to Woking, tail a little bit between their legs, but obviously, next time they'll sort of have something a little bit stronger in their arsenal, because as, they've spent so many years in the doldrums, they're still on their way back up.
Yeah, they're starting to close the gap up around them, aren't they? They've really started to make inroads on both Red Bull and on Ferrari as well, which we will come to, I'm sure. But very quickly, this is all your fault, by the way, JBL, because you wanted this kind of wet, dry, wet race, and that's kind of what we got. And there was it was a crucial moment in the race, or a crucial point in the race, really, where it was, do we change on to the slicks? Do we stay on the inters? Where do we go? And what do you think? I mean, do we think that maybe Hamilton and Russell got them changed too early, and Piastri and Norris did it all too late? What do we think? What general consensus of opinion?
I think, as we've kind of sort of like discussed about the overcut attempt, I think that did ultimately kind of work out. I think, they weren't going to gain anything by doing exactly the same as Verstappen and Russell ahead. That was kind of McLaren's shot of having a go. And Piastri kind of came at the other end of that. He'd stopped a little bit sooner than the rest. So there were a lot of moving pieces there. I think kind of about the time Verstappen and Russell pitted, that was probably the optimum time, because as we saw by the time Norris had come out, although it was still very wet on the pit exit, they'd got their tyres up to temperature by that point. So yeah, again, a lot of sort of moving parts. The interesting bit was after the second safety car, the two Mercedes pitting again. The interesting part about that was Russell and both Russell and Hamilton were a little bit unsure about that after the race. Hamilton said if he'd known that Russell had gone onto the medium tyres, then he might have stayed out. Russell said in a press conference that he was actually feeling quite good on the hard tyres that he'd already been given. So, if he'd had a little bit more information, he might have felt a little bit more enfranchised to stay out as well. So, yeah, I think Mercedes sort of came a little away from it thinking, was that the right call? They still got a podium out of it, obviously, but there's a chance for them to have two. So, ifs, buts and maybes.
Yeah, and I'm sure they'll be picking through it for a fair bit on the flight home and after that as well. Let's just quickly jump over to Mercedes then. And your thoughts, Charles, on this one, because it was a cracking fight really near the end, but on the TV, certainly on the British TV with Sky Sports anyway, there was a moment in the commentary where Crofty was the commentator saying that George Russell always seems to make a mistake, and it was more of it wasn't really him accusing Russell of not being a lead driver, but there was that question mark hanging over him. What are your thoughts there? Because he has done it. He finished third today, so it's great, but he has thrown away other opportunities. He's only had one win in Formula One so far.
Yeah, I think it was that moment over the curbs, wasn't it, where he was trying to push on. I think he just got ahead of Norris, if I'm correct. And I thought that was a little bit harsh at the time. George is obviously going to lead this team next year, and he needs a car that's capable to win. And I think this weekend, for once, I think they almost had it. They almost had it right there, didn't they? What they really needed was the track position. Again, George had it, but the race just didn't fall his way, did it? He looked reasonably strong out front at the start of the race. Obviously, Max put him under a little bit of pressure. And then, but then when Lando's car suddenly came alive, that really sort of kind of tripped him up. And then he had the trip over the chicane when he had the moment with Piastri as well. So, maybe Crofty does have a point. Maybe he is right there that George does have a mistake in him. But, he beat Lewis at the end of the day. I very much like the fact that they let them fight, and they had a nice fight over what became third place in the end. And, I think they're definitely, finally, Mercedes could be on the right trajectory. And again, we'll see at that litmus test in Barcelona for the next race.
Yeah, JBL, what's been going on at Mercedes? How come they've had this big leap and this move on? Don't forget, I mean, George Russell finished third with a really good fight with Lewis Hamilton right at the end, and Lewis Hamilton got the fastest lap. So something's been going on. What's happened?
I think it's been sort of like this continuous, and it's quite almost nebulous concept, but it's adding balance to the car. And the W15, it was a sort of very clean sheet design when it first emerged, very, very different to its predecessors. It was something that Mercedes needed to spend a little bit of time working out. And in the opening races, it had that sort of like relatively controversial front wing, and I think the team had decided that that was the best way forward for the car in that current specification. They needed to do other things around the car, floor, addressing sort of the envelope, I guess, of developing downforce, that kind of thing. And once they'd sort of hit upon what was, I guess, the right formula a few races ago, there was this new front wing that came in for Monaco, and that just seems to have set everything off. They came with another update for Canada as well, which was just some changes to the kind of the front corner, so suspension, brake ducts, that kind of area. It's just all about basically trying to make sure that the car is as balanced as possible. Going through what Lewis Hamilton has already said this weekend about where the car has struggled. He said that stability sort of overall has been better this year, and particularly sort of on corner entry. But when you're in that cornering phase, that's when the car starts to get a little bit sideways and a little bit unpredictable. So all of these changes have just been about addressing that and making sure that the car is a lot more predictable to drive. And once they've been able to do that, it was sort of getting that front wing on and dialed in Monaco. And now both cars have had it in Canada. It just seems to be the case that it's a lot more balanced. It seems to be doing what the drivers want it to do. Going through the GPS data the other day, it does seem to sort of serve that. Going through Verstappen and Russell's qualifying laps back to back. Mercedes also sort of had a little bit more on the straights. Out of traction, it was a lot stronger as well. It's just maybe a little bit more work is needed on that sort of in-corner balance, because that's where Verstappen was a lot stronger. But over the rest of the lap, the car seems to be very much improved.
Now, post-race, George Russell said it was a missed opportunity, that although it was a good thing they got their first podium of the season. I can't believe it, 9 races in, 18 opportunities to get a podium. They've secured one, Charles, but they've done it anyway. They've got their first podium of the season. But Lewis Hamilton said post-race that the car had the performance. I think he enjoyed himself out there today, didn't he, Lewis? But it had the performance to win the race. Now, is that a bit over-optimistic, or is that real, do you think?
I think it was a little bit over-optimistic, certainly from Lewis's point of view. After qualifying, he left himself with way too much to do, getting stuck behind Fernando in that first stint until the round of pit stops was never going to help his cause. As I said earlier, I think George was the guy who did have the shot at winning today. Things didn't really fall their way after a pretty strong first stint on those in those wet conditions. But I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that they've got they're completely back in the hunt, and then I expect them to go to Barcelona, and set pole position again. I mean, obviously, what happened on Saturday was quite surreal with the 0.00 seconds between them, and Lando just the 21 thousandths further back. So more of that, please. But I just think it is a little bit over optimistic to expect that. Let's say.
Okay, so what about the team then that were looking so strong coming into Canada? 24 points off the back of Red Bull, looking really, really good. They won at Monaco. They were flying high, and then the wheels pretty much fell off, didn't they, JBL? We know what happened to Carlos Sainz. He decided to take out Alex Albon as a bit of collateral damage. But what's going on there? It was a disastrous weekend. Talk us through the permutations of both.
Yeah, I think it all sort of had its genesis in obviously sort of very limited dry weather practice. That's when you really earn your money, and that's where you really have to extrapolate from incomplete data. And a lot of teams got it right and hit upon the right kind of setup in FP3, but Ferrari were finding a lot on Saturday morning that they just weren't getting their tyres into the right window. And they don't really know why. They don't know what they were doing particularly that was different to other teams. Carlos Sainz suggested that it was probably tyre prep and things like that. But then just going through the race as well, that set them on the back foot, because obviously they were eliminating Q2, but they were never really there in the race either. They really kind of struggled, particularly in the wet conditions. Both sort of drivers had Charles Leclerc particularly had a powertrain issue that he was managing. He was, pretty active on the steering wheel to try and alleviate the symptoms. He said, the suggestion over the radio was that he was losing about half a second. Sometimes it was more than that. So he was sort of very much out of the race at that point because he was just getting overtaken quite a lot in the dry. In the wet, it wasn't so much of a limitation, but when the circuit started to dry out, he said he was a sitting duck. For Sainz, similar struggles, but he was struggling a little bit more in the wet weather. When it started to get dry and once he was on slicks, he felt that he was able to fight a little bit more. But in saying that, he felt that he was taking a lot more risk as well. And so especially in sector 2, he was trying to sort of stay close through the hairpin as well and try and get somebody with DRS because there was a bit of a DRS train forming ahead of him. And then he just ended up putting a wheel on the grass, spinning, and poor old Alex Albon just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it was very, very unfortunate for Albon because he had a fantastic race. But yeah, Sainz sort of had a bit of a stinker from his perspective, and Leclerc's race was kind of a non-starter really. So really difficult day for Ferrari. No points on the board, not even a finish on the board. So that's going to be a huge dent in the Constructors' Championship.
Yeah, what you don't want is a double retirement, do you? You want at least one of your drivers to score, like Red Bull did. Now, Charles, with Ferrari looking, on the high from Monaco, coming here and having this disastrous weekend, it's going to be compounded. Surely they're going to be a bit more concerned heading back to Europe to Barcelona of the gains that McLaren and Mercedes have made.
Yeah, if I was them, I would be worried. I'd say the real concern was the 28 points that both McLaren and Mercedes gained on them, thanks to their 0 points in the Constructors' Championship today. And before that, they'd looked actually quite competitive towards Red Bull. Obviously, got a huge points haul in Monaco. I think Red Bull only scored 8, didn't they? It was definitely their worst weekend for a long time. But yes, I think what they'll hope to find in Barcelona is that they go back to that momentum, that sort of snowball effect that they had going previously, where they had pretty good, strong performance in the previous races coming here, and hope that, as Carlos Sainz suggests, that this was just a one-off. As JBL said, they just couldn't get the tyres working in the window, and a good example of it was Carlos's spin, because it was just really, really odd, wasn't it? It was like in the middle of the corner when the car's not really probably going at its slowest speed, it just swapped ends on him, got a proper swapper on. It's like one of those MotoGP front end folds where you can't explain why that happened. But it made him look quite dumb. And then, organisationally, they had the sort of Hail Mary of going for putting slicks on when it was raining. That wasn't the greatest day in the pits for the guys either. And obviously with the technical problem, that was that's something that they need to get on top of, and just hope that they haven't lost another ICE.
Yeah, I imagine it'll be a bit of a concern for them. Now, one team that will be fairly happy, not maybe very happy, but fairly happy with what they achieved this weekend is Aston Martin, finishing 6th and 7th, Alonso and Stroll respectively, JBL. A good result for Aston Martin, and maybe not making ground up on those ahead of them, but gaining some decent points and a bit of space between those behind them, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think Alonso did say the sort of P6 was kind of the maximum that he could expect, and behind the Red Bull, McLaren's, Mercedes, that pretty much sort of stands up. I don't think he said that it was one of his best races because, he said that quite a lot, and if he had, it would be one of probably about 100 best races he's ever had. But on a serious note, Aston Martin's been sort of relatively diligently making progress. I guess one of the criticisms levelled at it was that when it brings updates to a race, it doesn't necessarily switch them on quite as quickly as, say, McLaren does. It's not that kind of as instantaneous. But speaking to Tom McCulloch this morning for his usual Aston Martin kind of post-qualifying debrief, P-race sort of briefing, he was pretty confident that Aston was understanding the scope of the updates that it had brought. It continues to bring more. It's got more planned for the next few races. So things are just sort of relatively quietly building. Obviously, Barcelona will be the big test of that. Aerodynamically, it's a car that's a lot more efficient than last year's. It's just not hit the same heights as last year. And I think that's just mainly due to the relative progress of everybody else and Aston not making the same steps over the winter. There's sort of relatively sort of tentative reason to be cheerful there. They did a good job this weekend. It's just up to them to keep that going and eventually try and factor in podium fights once again as it happened last year.
Yeah, if we keep on looking further afield, I mean, Daniel Ricciardo, we look at other drivers, we're going to kind of touch on as many as we can, but Daniel Ricciardo finally got some points in a Grand Prix as opposed to a sprint race, but decent points haul for him. And it would have been more for RB had a Tsunoda not spun turn 9 4 laps from the end. But both of them, Charles, just quick thoughts on both drivers performance-wise.
Well, I certainly think Daniel needed a good weekend, didn't he, after the kind of shoe-in that Jake Villeneuve gave him on Sky on Friday. That certainly didn't seem to go down well with him, did it? But I think, again, it's almost going back to that Helmut Marko approach, isn't it? Do you need to kick up the backside or a cuddle? I think he did need a bit of a kick, and I think he's reacted in a very strong way. He was saying that it was finally he's put together an entire weekend. Miami was a bit of a half, wasn't it? With the sprint race, he was really good, and then the actual race, he wasn't really there. Let's just hope he can keep this momentum going, really, and claw his way back towards to the front end of the grid, because we know that he can do it. We know from 10 years ago here he made one of the most fantastic drives to win the race. And it's always good to see him up near the front. And then Tsunoda, again, another typically attacking drive from him today, and then he just overdid it. I don't know if he was legitimately trying to go to the left of the arrows board that he then took out, and almost took out that battle of 4 cars as well, didn't he? I think he had a very near miss with one of the Haas guys. But again, he's exciting to watch, and it's fun to see him around.
It's always fun to see him around. It's also fun to see other teams finishing inside the top 10, and Alpine did a decent job, didn't they, this weekend? JBL, they got 9th and 10th respectively, with Gasly and Ocon avoiding each other, which I think is the first thing we should say. They avoided each other out on track. And do you think this is going to give them, as a team, the Enstone lot, a bit of a boost as they head to Barcelona next time out?
In some ways, yes. In a lot of ways, no. I spoke to Esteban Ocon in the pen, and so for context, at the end of the race, there was a team orders call between him and Pierre Gasly. Ocon was asked to basically let Gasly through. They were sitting in 9th and 10th at the time. They hoped that they could try and get after Daniel Ricciardo ahead. And you could hear Ocon on the radio. He was a little bit het up about it and a little bit disappointed. Eventually acquiesced, and as he said in the pen, did his bit. But this is kind of the kicker. He was expecting perhaps the team to let Gasly back through on the final lap, because, as Ocon put it, Ricciardo was already 2.5 seconds ahead, so it would have been a little bit impossible for them to try and catch him in the final laps. As it happened, that his assessment was right. They never reversed the position, so Ocon was understandably absolutely furious. So, as again, he said he did his bit, but he didn't understand why Alpine didn't do its own bit. And it's true that they did avoid each other, but one can't help but think this is a legacy of the team now splitting up with Ocon, as it was announced earlier this week. Ocon won't be part of the team in 2025, and you can make your own conclusions about that, certainly, but Ocon was, even though he'd scored a point in 10th, which has been a rare occurrence this season, he was understandably, and I'll put this delicately, quite aggrieved by the decision. So, obviously not doing their bit for team harmony, Alpine. If, there was a sort of, talks in NATO or something, that is not the first team that I would choose to do any kind of de-escalation or anything like that. But nonetheless, they adapted to the conditions. They kept Ocon out for a very long time to try and anticipate a slick score. It worked quite well, and the team got 3 points, but it's probably the most unhappy 3 points that they'll ever get in their lives.
Strange, isn't it? 9 rounds into a 24 race season, and maybe Ocon, to use your analogy, Charles, needs a bit of an arm around him rather than a kick up the backside all the time.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation there. We always knew that these two drivers had a little bit of history with each other, and it was always going to be quite a tricky one to manage. And there's been such disruption at that team that I don't think I think they've just been allowed to free range, and they've just sort of gone off the handle again. We know that Ocon's had his problems with other teammates in the past as well. So yeah, I wouldn't like to be in that position of managing that. But I would like to see if Flavio Briatore does come back. I'd like to see how he would handle that situation. I'd imagine it would involve an immense amount of swearing.
I'm sure it would. And then, even then, JBL wouldn't be able to tell us what he says now. Then
yeah, exactly. No, you wouldn't. No one would know.
What about further afield? And any other honourable mentions you want to make, Charles? What about the two Haas drivers, their fantastic 5 laps? Or do you want to talk about anybody else that's a standout performer for whatever reason?
Yeah, my standout performer was definitely Kevin Magnussen for the agent of chaos that he usually brings to liven up races. Today, it was for all the right reasons, wasn't it? Running the extreme wet. The extreme wet never works, so how it suddenly did today, I guess they just rained harder than they expected, and it suddenly hit that perfect window, didn't it? And to have him, overtaking Piastri for 4th, catching Lando Norris, someone on the podium, set him fastest lap, I think on about lap 6, just before they then blew it, didn't they, by bringing him in too early. They should have left him out there for a little bit longer, switched to the intermediate when it was a better time to do it, because then he would have had the boost of having a fresh inter as well. And obviously Hülkenberg did the same ploy, but didn't get as far up the grid. So definitely Kevin Magnussen was my man of the day outside the top 10.
Lovely. JBL, have you got one?
I think I was going to agree, and Kevin was another driver that I spoke to in the pen. It's rare that I get to go in the pen because usually the press conference is on after, but it took quite a long time for the drivers to go through, so it was nice to sort of hear people lower down the grid kind of talking about their races. And yeah, Kevin agreed with the assessment that he was brought in too early. If it had been for a few more laps, yeah, he could, as Charles had already said, he could have put the inter on and then during the safety car period stayed on it, because he probably would have had enough offset to eventually do the same stint length that everybody else did. So I thought he was an impressive performer in those opening laps. And Alex Albon, again, as I've already mentioned, really doing a fantastic race. He did a fantastic overtake on both Daniel Ricciardo and Esteban Ocon, went round to one and then squeezed in and went down the inside of the other. So that was a fantastic move. It had shades of, I can't remember who it was in Formula E I watched do that. I think it was Edo Mortara actually that did a similar move at Diriyah a couple of years ago, just using every single inch of space available to do it. So yeah, that was a fantastic little move, and was on for points today, but unfortunately just got taken out by Sainz, and it's a bit of a loss for Williams as well, especially because Alpine scored a decent hatful of points.
Yeah, absolutely right. Let's quickly jump on to 2 weeks' time. Final question pretty much for you both. 2 weeks' time, Barcelona. This is traditionally a circuit where we see a lot of major upgrades brought. What are you both expecting to see or hoping to see? Maybe they're two different questions. Charles?
I'm hoping not to see a Red Bull front row, as much as it sounds like I've got it in for Sergio Perez today, because we normally see a sort of Noah's Ark grid at Barcelona, don't we, where it's just two Red Bulls, 2 Mercedes, 2 McLarens, etc. What I'd like to see is just a little bit of variety in that, and just like we saw this weekend where it was a little bit mixed up. We had McLaren and Mercedes right in the mix. I'd like for Ferrari to go back to bringing that momentum that they had before this race too. But I think the fear is always when you go to Barcelona, it's such an aero track, isn't it, that it always just lends itself towards Red Bull and that fantastic machine that Adrian Newey and Pierre Wack have made. So fingers crossed for a good one, but yeah, we'll see.
Obviously, it's traditionally a place where we see a lot of aero updates brought, and as Charles already said, it is sort of very aero dependent. It really rewards those who have got really good underbody downforce, because it's got a lot of long radius and high speed corners. Turn 3, you've got Kampsa as well, and I guess the sort of revived final 2 corners as well. So yeah, I think it's gonna be show a lot of car performance. It's a circuit that teams have a lot of data on, which is why they usually bring updates there. And it rewards those high-speed characteristics. So I would be surprised if anyone other than Red Bull won it. But again, teams will bring updates. They will have opportunity to bed them in over the practice sessions. And hopefully it rewards us with a little bit of a different picture. I think it will really show us where everybody is, where everybody stacks up. And ultimately, I'm also just hoping for a good Barcelona race, because unfortunately those are in short supply, and I think I might be in one of the minorities, in the minority here. But I'm just looking forward to when F1 moves to Madrid for the Spanish Grand Prix, because Barcelona, we've sort of been there, done it. Not really a lot to get excited about, unfortunately.
It's a nice track to run around, though. I've run around that once or twice before. It's quite a nice one, actually. So if you've got your trainers and you're out there in 2 weeks' time, go for a little jog. Why not? Look, gents, thank you very much indeed, as always. Charles, thank you very much to yourself and to you as well, JBL. Don't forget when you come back to bring some maple syrup. That was highly on the agenda.
Cheers.
Cheers, Bryn. It comes in cans, funnily enough, so I'll try and sneak a couple through for you.
Please do, but do it legally. Thanks very much there to the guys, and hopefully you have enjoyed this episode as well. It wasn't quite to be for McLaren and Lando Norris. 56 years to the day that Bruce McLaren got the first ever win for McLaren, but it wasn't for him because Max Verstappen was there once again. As always, thanks very much for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe and get in touch with your comments as well so we can see what you think of the race we all just witnessed. Until next time, thanks for watching. We'll see you then.